Hi, everyone. My name is Hannah,
And my name is Diana.
and this is our contrastive analysis project. We're focusing on Italian and English.
This is the background. It says benvenuti. It means welcome in Italian. This is a history of the Italian language. Latin was used only for the written communication. A mix of Latin and regional mother language was used for verbal communication. After the barbaric invasion of 476 BC, the vulgar Roman language emerged. From there, poets and authors contributed to the major language changes that occurred from Latin to Romance and finally Italian. Authors like Dante Alighieri, Francesco Petrarca, and Giovanni Boccaccio contributed to this major change. This is the history of the Italian language, more in depth. The official language was Latin, as mentioned before, but after the 476 AD, the Vulgar Roman language or Romance was spoken. Roman language went through a dialectical changes, resulting in different languages: Italian, Romanian, French, Spanish, and Portuguese. The lesser known Romance dialects are Galician, Catalan, Occitan, Romanesco, Sardinian, and Aromanian. Northern Africa had African Romance due to the conquest, and Britain also had British Latin due to their conquest in 43 AD. And to the right, we see a trickling graph of how Latin contributed to different languages throughout the years. These are some fun facts. Did you know that the Italian alphabet consists of only 21 letters? The letters J, K, W, X, and Y are not included. Italian wasn't considered the official language of Italy until 1861, when only 3 to 5% of Italians spoke the language at that time. The modern Italian language originated in the region of Tuscany, along with other mother languages of the regions combined made up the Italian language. 98% of Italians are Roman Catholic, which, to no surprise, because the Vatican City is the world's smallest country and it is found inside of Italy. There are 63 million people who speak Italian as their first language around the world, making Italian the 20th most spoken language in the world.
And now I'm going to take us through the linguistic features of Italian and compare them to English. So, first, with the writing system in Italian, it's an almost completely phonetic language. That means it has a very strong one-to-one correspondence between the letters and the sounds that they make, along with a couple exceptions. The stress placement and vowel quality aren't notated in the written language, and those are used to determine the meaning of words. So it is important in the spoken component. The S and Z may or may not be voiced when speaking, and the I and U may represent vowels or semi-vowel sounds. And lastly, H is considered a muted consonant, which means it is silent and used in very few cases outside of the CH and GH digraphs. When looking at the Italian alphabet, it is composed of 5 vowels and 16 Italian consonants, and then they also include those 5 borrowed or foreign consonants in a lot of their words that you see coming from Latin and then in foreign names. Included on the bottom is a video that you can watch yourself that will help you go through how to pronounce all of the different letters in the Italian alphabet. When thinking about the vowels, there are 5 vowels that make up 7 vowel sounds. All of them have only one sound except for E and O, which both have a mid-low and mid-high sound. Almost all words in Italian end in vowels, and that's something you'll often notice in Italian English accents when Italian speakers may add short vowel sounds like ah to the ends of English consonant ending words. Vowel quality affects the placement of affects Vowel quality affects placement of stress and can determine the meaning of words. And they use that a lot to dictate the speakers, and the purpose of their sentences. Vowel pronunciation is the main way that regional accents are distinguished across Italy. And the vowels are used at the end for a number of things, including to indicate plurality, which is different from English. For example, libro means book versus libri means books. When looking at the consonants, there are 21 distinct consonant phonemes, and there's a couple important things to note. The first is that double consonants in Italian are unique. Each letter in a double consonant is pronounced. For example, the word spelled P-A-P-P-A in English would be pronounced papa, but in Italian is more of a papa. There's another sound produced by the GN digraph that does not have a sound in English, but it's similar to the Spanish ñ and is represented in words such as lasagna. The SH sound in English is produced by a spelling of SCI or SCE, and you can see that in words like prosciutto. And lastly, in Italian, they have a trilled or rolled R sound that appears it appears when R is the initial letter, when it precedes or follows a consonant, or when R is doubled. And I'll come back to this R sound later because it is one of the main challenges for Italian speakers trying to work on their English pronunciations. When comparing the phonology of these two words, Italian has 28 distinct phonemes to English's 44. Italian is incredibly phonetic in its spelling, whereas English is complex and has a lot of irregular spellings. The main difference is in the vowels. There's only 7 vowel phonemes, with most vowels in Italian only having one phoneme, whereas English has 19 vowel phonemes, and vowel pronunciation can be one of the biggest challenges for Italian English learners. English vowel phonemes include 6 long vowels, 5 short vowels, 3 diphthongs, 2 oo sounds, and 3 R-controlled vowel sounds, which is very complex for an Italian speaker. There are 21 consonant phonemes in Italian and 25 consonant phonemes in English, so those are very closely matched. The main thing to note is that English has a lot more cluster consonant sounds and contains those 5 extra consonants, J, K, W, X, and Y. When looking at the similarities, they both use the Roman alphabet, and they share those 14 consonants with similar pronunciations. And a lot of the similarities come because Italian comes directly from Latin, and English has heavy influence from Latin as well, even though our words are not as derivative as they are in Italian. Morphology is where Italian gets a lot of its main meaning, and it's a very complex practice. Verbs are complicated in Italian. They can be used to denote inflection, derivation, and conjugation. For example, you can change a verb to show first person singular, second person singular, and third person singular. And you can also use it to change tense, kind of like we do in English. For example, changing it from to read to reading. Where it gets a lot different from English is when you look at your nouns and your adjectives. Nouns and adjectives both also include gender and number, which are indicated by different vowel endings on both words. There is no neutral gender in Italian, so everything is either feminine or masculine. And the adjectives have to agree with the nouns that they modify. So if you have a feminine plural noun, you need a feminine plural adjective to go with it. When looking at word forms, there are a lot of prefixes and suffixes that we add to root words to change the meaning and grammatical category of Italian words. For example, you can take a noun and see that it was derived from an adjective. And compounding is a very common practice in Italian where they combine 2 words to create a new word. For example, the Italian word for station master comes from a combination of the words head and station. And then I've listed a handful of the definite articles that are used to indicate different gender and number combinations in Italian. I'm not going to go over them all with you now, but they're there for you to see just how complex the vowel system is within Italian and just how important morphology is to determining meaning. When comparing the 2 languages, the main similarity is their SVO word order. I'll talk about that more later, but what that stands for is subject, verb, object, and it's the main way both Italian and English sentences are structured. The difference is that Italian can be a lot more fluid and fusional in its structure, whereas English is much more analytical in its structure. Italian heavily utilizes inflectional endings, whereas English has much fewer and less complex inflections. Italian has grammatical gender and English does not. And the verb conjugations are complex and have multiple tenses, moods, and subjects in Italian, whereas English conjugations are much more simplistic and usually only used to signify number and tense. When looking at the syntax of Italian, it follows that basic SVO word order, which is similar to English, but where it differs is that subjects can be left out of an Italian sentence when a verb's ending makes it clear who the subject is. In Italian, the adjective comes after the noun, and pronouns typically come before the verbs, but again, that order is more fluid and it can change depending on where you want the emphasis to be between an object and a verb in your sentence. Most negatives follow a very simplistic pattern of adding non before the verb to show that it is negated. And questions are also a bit more fluid in their structure, where they're typically indicated by a rising annotation when you're speaking at the end instead of using other markers or words that we may see in English, such as our who, what, where, when, and why words. Here's a sample sentence to show you just how an Italian sentence comes together. So our first word here has two components. It represents the verb, which is to eat, but it ends in IO, which is the first person singular vowel ending, showing that this whole phrase stands for I eat, and we don't have the actual subject in front of the verb. Next, we see our adverb, happily, which is different from English, where typically the adverb will come between your subject and your verb. Then we have a two-word combination for our object. This is our noun and our pronoun. The word is apple, and you can see that it is a singular feminine, denoted by that A at the end of both words. The final word in our sentence is the adjective red, and it matches the feminine singular in the noun. So altogether, the sentence is that I happily eat a red apple.
So the way we would say the sentence and really pronounce these endings and really emphasize the meaning of each word, you would say, Mangio volentieri una mela rosa. Mangio means I eat. The I-O, as you said, emphasizes that it shows who is eating. Mangio, or if you were eating, is mangia, or if somebody else is eating, manja. But to say who is eating, the last part of the word emphasizes that. So mangio volentieri kind of sounds like voluntarily, but in Italian, it would be happily. Una mela, mela meaning apple, una signifying one apple. Rosa is the color, and as it says, it's a feminine word, so it just brings it all together.
When we go to compare Italian to English, like I've been saying, they have that similar word order pattern, but Italian is much more flexible since their meaning comes from their morphology instead of their syntax. English depends a lot more on their word order to give across their meaning. In Italian, the adjectives come after the noun, whereas in English, the adjectives come before the noun. Italian sentences and words can be much longer because they have more descriptors attached, whereas English sentences and words are much more concise and direct in their meaning. Italian has grammatical agreement rules around adjectives needing to match the gender and number of their nouns, and there are no such rules in English because our adjectives don't typically represent number, and there is no gender matching in any of our words in English. When we think about the semantics, words can have multiple meanings depending on the context that they're used in Italian, and this can also differ from what they may mean in English. For example, one word could mean good, kind, and tasty, where tasty in English has a slightly different connotation than the other two words, but they all come from the same Italian word. Vowel quality and stress can also change the meaning of a word. For example, one word spelled P-E-S-C-A has two different pronunciations, one meaning peach and one meaning fish. So the way that you stress your vowels, and put emphasis on different syllables is going to change the meaning of a word, and there are no accent marks to help you out beyond the context that the word is used in. And the meaning of the sentences does depend on word order, but it also really depends on the choice of those prepositions and all of the different articles that you can use to modify your verbs and your nouns. When we look at the varieties of Italian, Standard Italian comes from the Tuscan dialect, but there are 30 plus different regional dialects across Italy. Some of them are so different from Standard Italian that they could be considered their own language. When thinking about formality in Italian, one of the main things is the formal versus informal you. The informal you is used for somebody your own age or younger, and for somebody that you may know well. Whereas the formal you is for somebody that's older than you or somebody that you don't know as well. And then, along with everything else in Italian, all of those different verb endings are going to change based on the formality level that you're using while you're speaking. When thinking about the difficulties that an Italian speaker may have when learning English, the big ones come across in phonology and morphology with the inflection and pronunciations. I already talked about how that rolling R makes it challenging to produce the much more smooth R sound in English. And English has all of those increased vowel phonemes combined with the fact that there are added vowel sounds at the end of Italian words. And those two things conflict, making it hard to pronounce a lot of what we would consider to be more simple English words. And lastly, the TH sound doesn't exist in Italian. And that, coupled with the fact that H is a muted consonant, makes that an incredibly challenging sound for an Italian speaker to produce. When thinking about spelling patterns, English is complex, especially because Italian is an incredibly phonetic language, and English has all these additional phonemes, and its sources of its borrowed words come from a much greater array of languages, whereas Italian draws mostly from Latin, making it much harder for Italian speakers to pick up on the different patterns happening across spellings. And now we're going to go into the cultural norms and implications.
Okay, so the communicative style of Italian, it has two different possibilities. There's nonverbal gestures. In Italian, it is a high context culture, meaning that implied meaning is used without words to suggest full context of the discussion, or some words may be implicative of just the surrounding conversation. So you have to have an eye for what is going on, pay attention to their facial expressions, their hand gestures. Um, so as I said, nonverbal cues play a lot into this communicative style. Hand gestures used to express or amplify meaning in a conversation. The famous, to it may have different meanings, but the most common meaning is like good. So if you say this is good, fa molto buono, it means it's very good. Or to amplify meaning, it can be used different ways, but it's mostly for a good connotation. So facial expressions used in a conversation create emphasis as well. Just in like in any other language, facial expressions can really impact the way you understand the conversation. But in Italian, facial expressions are used more often and may be indicative of an implied meaning. Verbal communication consists of initial small talk to encompass the similarities and differences between the parties in conversation. This refers to the initial conversation between two people who have not met before. You begin with like just any topic of conversation, and then from there, according to similarities or differences, um, you will then proceed with bella figura language, which highlights the positive over the negative. So it more so means the way you react to the environment around you as you're in conversation. For example, you're in a restaurant and you have a waitress which seems to you is coming off as rude. The bella figura language implies that you wouldn't be rude to this person even though they're being rude to you. So you're protecting their bella figura. Bella figura means beautiful figure. You want to keep their image untainted, but you approach it in a kind manner. Um, and then the verbal communication favored over written communication to express meaning part of this means as Italians, they value facial expressions and hand gestures. So if you were to express, let's say, a written communication to somebody, you don't get those physical cues. And as Italian culture, if you don't have those physical cues, you're going to misunderstand the information. Sometimes it's prone to happen where you misunderstand the information. Um, and that's why this last bullet says in-person meeting favored over written communication like texting or email is important for interacting with teacher-parent conferences, especially when you have perhaps an Italian transfer student whose parent is also Italian, of course. You would want to maybe call them instead of emailing in order for them to fully get the gist of your expressions so that minimal misinterpretations come through. Pragmatics refer to the flow of speech and turn taking. Due to the fast paced communicative style common amongst Italians, finding gaps to speak in between may be difficult. It is important to use meaningful add ons to the conversation to get the message across to avoid ambiguous statements. This refers to there not being much of any gaps for people to add in to the conversation. It's more of like a running on conversation where you have to pitch in your information or your ideas whenever you can, and sometimes you end up speaking over each other. But in the Italian culture, it is not seen. It isn't looked as something that's rude. It's just part of conversation. So if you have an idea, you have to pitch in and contribute to the overlapping of conversations. Um, Implicative communication, this kind of relates to the last slide. Though conversation may flow freely, implied meaning makes it difficult for non Italians to understand. It is important to become familiar with phrases, facial expressions, and body language common to Italian speakers. Um, like I said, this relates to the last slide on the nonverbal cues. So as a non-Italian, if you if you're going to have Italian students, um, it might be beneficial to learn the nonverbal cues, the phrases, the facial expressions, so as to avoid any ambiguity between teacher and student or teacher and parent.
So Diana did a lot of this, but I can kind of explain some of the comparisons and contrasts between Italy and the United States. So both cultures are rather individualistic, although Southern Italy itself could be seen as a more collectivist culture. Both cultures are success-oriented, and they have an oh my goodness, egalitarian gender roles, which means they don't follow traditional gender roles. We empower both genders to seek whatever positions they may be interested in. Italy has a medium power distance culture, which means they value equality and decentralized power. And it is more of the medium ranking because the younger generations are much so more in favor of small power distance than the older generations, which typically seem to go for a larger power distance. The United States is a small power distance culture where a lot of hierarchy exists simply for organizational convenience, where we have management structures and social classes. But when you think about actual communication, our communication is very direct and informal across these different class systems. So even though someone may be your manager, you don't super change the way you address or speak to them as you would to somebody who is your colleague or subordinate. All of those levels are very similar in English and in the United States. Italy is a high context culture like Diana just brought us through all of those different physical cues and nonverbal communication aspects, such as gestures and facial expressions. Whereas in the United States, there's not a lot of that. It's a much more low context culture where we rely on more explicit and direct messaging and don't so much leverage gestures and expressions to give across our meaning. I can go through the classroom implications and tips as well. When we think about communicating with our students and their parents, it's important to be direct, but to be kind, as Diana already talked us through. Conversations, oh, did that pop up everywhere? Okay. Conversations will arise and turn taking may become difficult, but it's important to find ways to express what needs to be addressed in a parent meeting between yourself as the teacher, the students, and any other adults in the space. Students may prefer teamwork over control and supervision, and it's important to keep that in mind when planning activities and lessons for your Italian students. There needs to be ways to create an environment where students can work together and rely on each other rather than working independently and relying only on a teacher as a resource. And lastly, it's important to provide plenty of opportunities for students to get involved and accustomed to their new environment, to guide them through the cultural norms in their new country, and also to learn what part of Italy they are from, since the different regions of Italy have different dialects and different cultural norms. And that will help understanding their specific communication styles much easier. And that was the end of our presentation. If you're interested in seeing our references, you can check out the last few slides on our slide deck. Otherwise, thank you for watching.
Thank you for watching. Grazie.